Comrades, awaken. Open your eyes to the world as it truly is. For the chains that bind you are not invisible, they are forged in play. Sight in the institutions, the laws, and the marketplaces that claim to serve freedom while enslaving you. The system does not merely govern your bodies, it governs your minds, your desires, your sense of what is possible. It whispers, accept, endure, be grateful. And in that whisper, it binds you tighter than any iron shackle ever could. Why does the system want you silent? It is because your voice is a weapon. Your voice, when joined with thousands of others, pierces the facade of order that the ruling class calls stability. The owners of capital, the lords of production, the profiteers of misery, they rely not merely on wealth, but on your obedience. They rely on your submission, your isolation, your belief that you have no power. For a silent, atomized working class is a compliant working class. And a compliant working class is the foundation upon which their dominion is built. Look around you. The streets, the offices, the factories, the digital corridors where you are told to connect and engage. All of this is structured to keep you distracted from the truth that you create value every day, yet you are denied the wealth that your labor produces, the truth that while your hands build, sow, cook, and compute the fruits of, your toil are siphoned into the pockets of the few who never lifted a finger. This is not accident. Comrades, it is deliberate. Capitalism is not merely an economic system, it is a machine designed to extract, to alienate, and to silence. The system teaches you to doubt yourself, to fear rebellion, to internalize guilt for the injustices you endure. Be grateful for what you have, it says, while it strips away what is rightfully yours. Do not question authority, it whispers, while it reshapes reality to favor the wealthy. And yet, in every corner of this world, this silence is not natural. It is manufactured. Your voice is the crack in the dam, the tremor beneath the foundation, the threat that they know they cannot contain if it spreads. But silence is not destiny. Awareness is the first spark of revolt. Comrades, understand this. The enemy is not abstract. It is concentrated in the hands of those who control the means of production, the circulation of ideas, and the instruments of violence. These are the capitalists, the ruling elites, the administrators of oppression. They divide you by nationality, by race, by gender, by religion, so that you never recognize the common thread of your exploitation. They wage war on your solidarity because they know that united, the working class is unstoppable. It is through your voice, amplified in collective action, that this system can be shattered. Organization is your armor, class consciousness is your sword. Speak not merely for yourself, but for all who toil under the weight of exploitation. Demand what is yours, your labor's value, your dignity, your freedom. In unity there is power. In solidarity there is strategy. In rebellion there is inevitability. The history of humanity is the history of class struggle. Every advance in justice, every expansion of liberty has come not from the benevolence of the rulers, but from the courage of those who refuse to endure. The system fears your voice because it carries the knowledge of your strength. It fears your voice because when you speak, others will hear, and when others hear, they will rise. And when the many rise together, no fortress of capital can withstand the collective will of the oppressed. Do not be lulled into passivity by promises, by spectacle, by illusion. The system's silence is a trap, a cage disguised as order. Your words are the hammer that shatters illusions. Your voice is the signal that the chains are breaking. Speak, organize, act not tomorrow, not when the timing seems convenient, but now. For every day of silence is another day they steal. From you, another day they tighten the stranglehold on your lives. Comrades, let us awaken to the truth of our condition. Let us recognize that our oppression is structural, our exploitation systemic, and our liberation collective. The world does not change because the few concede it changes, because the many refuse to obey. Lift your voices, link your hands, sharpen your minds, and prepare to reclaim what is yours. The power of the system lies in our silence. The power of the people lies in our unity in action. And when that unity speaks, it will not whisper. It will roar. The time for fear is over. The time for silence has ended. The time for our voice, our collective, revolutionary, unstoppable voice is now. The system relies on your silence to maintain control and exploit your labor, because silence is the most insidious form of oppression. It is not the chains that bind your hands that are most dangerous, but the invisible chains that bind your mind. The rulers of capital understand this well. They do not merely seek to extract your labor. They seek to shape the way you think about labor, about value, about justice, and about your own potential. When you remain silent, when you accept the world as it is without question, you give consent to a system that thrives on your subjugation. They depend upon your acceptance of inequality, your willingness to endure exploitation without complaint, and your belief that resistance is futile. Silence is not neutrality. It is the soil in which domination grows. Every unspoken grievance, every suppressed complaint, every swallowed frustration nourishes the structures that oppress you. It allows the system to continue without challenge, to redistribute wealth upward, and to normalize the disparity between those who toil and those who profit. When you do not speak, when you do not question, when you do not organize, your labor is commodified without your participation in its value. The work you perform, the skills you bring, the energy you expend, all of this is converted into profit for those who do not produce, who do not risk, who do not sacrifice. And yet the ideology surrounding labor tells you to be silent, to be patient, to be grateful for crumbs while the banquet is stolen from your table. The system inculcates this silence through countless mechanisms. Through education that teaches obedience rather than critical thinking. Through media that distracts and pacifies. Through laws that criminalize dissent. And through social norms that shame resistance as selfish or dangerous. It presents you with a world in which the structures of oppression seem inevitable, natural and eternal, convincing you that your voice cannot matter. The silence it demands is both external and internal. It seeks to shape not only what you say, but what you think, what you imagine, what you hope for. It convinces you that your dissatisfaction is your fault, that poverty, insecurity and exhaustion are personal failings rather than systemic impositions. By making you doubt yourself, the system prevents solidarity, because a silent, self-doubting worker is unlikely to recognize common interests with others who endure the same conditions. The ruling class knows that division is their greatest ally. When you speak, even quietly, you assert your presence, your dignity, and your awareness of injustice. But when your voice is silenced, the illusion of power remains intact. The factory hums, the office ticks, the commerce flows, and the few continue to accumulate wealth at the expense of the many. Every act of silence strengthens the mechanisms of control, the underpayment of labor, the normalization of precarious employment, the erosion of rights, and the extraction of value from human effort. The system thrives not because it is efficient, but because it discourages challenge. It survives because it convinces the oppressed that resistance is dangerous, disorganized, or impossible. It disguises its exploitation as inevitability, and it cloaks inequality in the language of meritocracy, opportunity, and freedom. But the truth is revealed in the daily lives of the workers, the long hours, the lack of choice, the debt that follows effort, the disconnection from the product of labor, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of those who did not toil. The system's reliance on silence is its most cunning strategy because it is invisible, because it turns the oppressed into their own jailers, and because it ensures that labor can be exploited without complaint. To break the chains of this system, one must first break the silence. One must recognize that speaking, protesting, organizing, and demanding justice are not acts of rebellion alone. They are acts of self-preservation, acts of reclaiming the value that is constantly extracted, acts of asserting the humanity that the system seeks to reduce to mere utility. Every voice raised is a threat to those who profit from silence, because every word spoken undermines the legitimacy of exploitation, reveals the inequality of the social order, and plants the seed of collective awareness. The laborer who speaks is no longer invisible. The worker who organizes can no longer be ignored. The oppressed who unite form a force that the system cannot contain, because the power of capital depends entirely on disunity, compliance, and the quiet acceptance of injustice. Silence, therefore, is not merely absence of speech, it is complicity in your own oppression, a gift to the exploiters, and a foundation upon which domination rests. Breaking that silence is the first and indispensable step toward liberation, because a people who dare to speak cannot be controlled in the same way as those who are mute. Capitalism divides and isolates the working class to prevent solidarity, because a fragmented workforce is a powerless workforce. The ruling class understands that collective strength is the only threat to their dominion, and therefore they invest immense energy in ensuring that workers see each other not as comrades in struggle but as competitors, as strangers, as obstacles in the pursuit of survival under a system that pits labor against labor. From the moment of birth, the ideology of division is woven into the fabric of society. Children are taught to aspire individually rather than collectively, to measure themselves against others rather than question the structures that enforce inequality. Schools present competition as natural, success as a personal triumph, and failure as a personal flaw, obscuring the systemic forces that distribute opportunity unevenly. In the workplace, this logic is enforced even more ruthlessly. Workers are encouraged to compete for wages, promotions, and recognition, while those who exploit labor remain insulated from the consequences of this competition. Racism, sexism, nationalism, and other social hierarchies are amplified and weaponized to create divisions among workers who otherwise share common conditions and common interests. The system teaches one worker to see another as an adversary rather than a fellow laborer, to blame neighbors for poverty rather than the structures that enforce it, and to distrust the very potential for collective action that could transform their reality. In the factories, offices, and digital platforms, isolation is reinforced through alienation. The worker is separated from the product of their labor, disconnected from the process, and estranged from the outcome, while simultaneously estranged from colleagues who endure the same alienation. This structural separation is both physical and psychological. Cubicles, assembly lines, competitive work metrics, and individualized contracts all work to prevent the formation of bonds and shared understanding. The capitalist system also manipulates ideology to reinforce these divisions. Media perpetuate narratives that glorify individualism, reward the appearance of self-made success, and obscure the systemic theft of labor's value. Religion, culture, and civic institutions are often co-opted to promote conformity, patience, and acceptance, teaching workers that inequality is a moral test, a divine will, or a natural order rather than a mechanism of exploitation. Furthermore, capitalism exploits geographic and social mobility to fracture communities. Migration, urbanization, and gentrification separate workers from established networks, dissolving the communal bonds that could support collective resistance. Economic precarity ensures that survival becomes a daily struggle, leaving little energy for organization, discussion, or solidarity. When workers are exhausted, insecure, and isolated, their attention is consumed with meeting immediate needs rather than challenging the system that generates those needs. The divisions are reinforced by laws and policies that criminalize collective action, strike, or protest, making solidarity not only difficult but potentially dangerous. Employers and states collaborate to suppress unions, monitor gatherings, and label dissent as radical, extremist, or disruptive. All of these measures create an environment in which workers internalize fragmentation, believing that their struggles are individual and their failures personal. Yet this isolation is entirely strategic. Capitalists understand that united, organized workers have the power to demand fair wages, humane conditions, shorter hours, and even the redistribution of wealth. Solidarity transforms fear into courage, weakness into strength, and dispersed labor into concentrated force. The ruling class's dependence on division reveals its fragility. Without the cooperation of the many, the privileges of the few cannot be maintained. History demonstrates repeatedly that when workers recognize their shared conditions and act collectively, they disrupt the flow of capital, challenge hierarchical control, and reclaim the value that was stolen from them. Strikes, protests, and revolutions are not spontaneous accidents. They are the inevitable consequences of workers overcoming imposed divisions, understanding their common interests, and asserting their collective power. To overcome capitalism's isolation, workers must identify the mechanisms of division, the social, economic, and ideological tools that prevent solidarity. They must recognize the shared nature of exploitation, reject narratives that pit them against one another, and form networks of mutual support and cooperation. Only when workers see themselves as part of a broader class, connected across workplaces, regions, and identities, can they harness the power of collective action. Solidarity is not merely moral, it is strategic. It is the precondition for resistance, the foundation of negotiation, and the means by which exploitation can be challenged and eventually dismantled. Capitalism's strength is built on the perception of individual struggle. Its weakness is exposed when workers recognize their collective strength. Understanding that division is manufactured is the first step toward overcoming it. Awareness breeds unity, and unity breeds power. Isolation is a tool of oppression. Solidarity is the instrument of liberation. The capitalist system depends on workers remaining isolated, atomized, and distrustful, and it is in breaking these imposed boundaries that the potential for transformation resides. Awareness and class consciousness are the first steps toward liberation, because without understanding the structures that dominate, exploit, and oppress, the worker remains trapped in a cycle of compliance and illusion. The system relies on ignorance and false consciousness to maintain its power, convincing those who toil that their suffering is natural, inevitable, or deserved. From birth, individuals are conditioned to see their circumstances as personal rather than systemic, to interpret poverty as failure, to accept scarcity as a universal law, and to believe that the wealth and privileges of the ruling class are justified by merit or virtue. This ideological conditioning masks the reality of exploitation. The fact that labor creates value while capital extracts it, that work is coerced and commodified, and that the fruits of human effort are concentrated in the hands of those who did not contribute to their production. Awareness begins with seeing these truths clearly, with identifying the mechanisms by which the ruling class sustains domination. It requires understanding that economic inequality is not a natural phenomenon, but a deliberate structure, maintained through the ownership of the means of production, the control of information, the manipulation of social divisions, and the enforcement of legal and political systems that protect private wealth. Class consciousness emerges when workers recognize themselves not as isolated individuals struggling for survival, but as members of a collective whose labor is systematically exploited. It is the knowledge that the conditions one endures are shared by millions, that the interests of the worker are fundamentally opposed to the interests of the capitalist, and their liberation cannot be achieved alone, but only through collective action. Consciousness transforms perception. What once seemed personal hardship now appears as social injustice. What once seemed inevitable now appears as a condition that can be challenged and changed. It reveals the patterns of exploitation, the mechanisms of alienation, and the strategies of domination that sustain inequality. Once awareness is cultivated, it generates critical thinking, analysis, and discussion, breaking the spell of false narratives that encourage passivity and compliance. Workers begin to see the illusions of competition, the manufactured divisions, and the ways in which ideology serves the interests of those in power rather than the needs of the many. They understand that wages, working conditions, housing, health, and education are not gifts but rights, and that their denial is a product of systemic oppression. Class consciousness also illuminates the power of collective action. Individual effort, though necessary for survival under capitalism, cannot challenge systemic exploitation. But when workers organize, speak with one voice and act in unison, they acquire the capacity to disrupt the flow of capital, to demand justice, and to reclaim the value that has been stolen from them. Consciousness creates unity because understanding shared conditions fosters empathy, trust, and recognition of common interests. It allows workers to see beyond superficial differences of race, gender, religion, or nationality that have been exploited to divide and weaken them. Awareness is both analytical and moral. It exposes the structural roots of oppression and calls forth a sense of duty to resist, to support fellow workers, and to challenge the legitimacy of a system built on inequality. Without consciousness, labor remains atomized, passive, and complicit in its own exploitation. With consciousness, the potential for resistance emerges. Workers begin to recognize that strikes, protests, unions, cooperative institutions, and political movements are not acts of rebellion alone, but instruments of liberation grounded in the collective power of the oppressed. Class consciousness turns suffering into understanding, anger into strategy, and isolation into solidarity. It is the seed from which revolutionary change grows, because only those who understand the nature of oppression can envision and enact a system that prioritizes human need over private profit. Awareness compels action. It transforms the passive endurance of injustice into organized, deliberate struggle. It dismantles illusions of inevitability, replaces fear with purpose, and provides the theoretical foundation for practical resistance. Education, dialogue, and shared experience are the vehicles by which consciousness spreads, creating networks of solidarity across workplaces, communities, and nations. When a people recognize the systemic nature of their oppression and the collective strength they wield, the structures of domination begin to tremble. Consciousness is both weapon and shield. It equips the worker to navigate the system strategically, resist manipulation, and unify others under the banner of shared interest. In short, liberation begins in the mind because the recognition of oppression, the understanding of systemic exploitation, and the awareness of collective power are the conditions without which revolution cannot occur. Until consciousness is awakened, exploitation persists unquestioned, inequality remains naturalized, and the worker is bound not only by material chains but by the invisible chains of ignorance and false belief. Collective organization and unified action are the true sources of power because the individual, left alone, is at the mercy of the structures that exploit labor, concentrate wealth, and enforce inequality. The capitalist system thrives on atomization, on turning workers into isolated units competing for survival, pitting one against another so that the inherent strength of the many is never realized. Alone, a single worker can demand little, resist little, and challenge nothing, because the mechanisms of power, the ownership of the means of production, the control of capital, the enforcement of laws are concentrated in the hands of a few. But when workers come together, when they recognize their shared interests and organize their efforts, they create a force capable of challenging even the most entrenched structures of domination. Collective organization transforms fragmented suffering into coordinated strategy, diffuse anger into focused action, and isolated labor into a coherent force that cannot be ignored. It is through organization that workers can negotiate, strike, and disrupt the processes that extract value from their toil. It is through collective structures, unions, councils, committees, and assemblies that labor acquires the capacity to articulate its demands, enforce them, and defend its members from retaliation. Unified action is the practical expression of solidarity. It turns awareness and consciousness into tangible power. A strike, for example, is not simply a withdrawal of labor. It is a statement that the individual's work is not theirs to give without recognition, that collective effort can stop the wheels of production, and that the value of labor cannot be appropriated without consent. When workers act together, the balance of power shifts, even temporarily, and the illusion of inevitability that sustains capitalism is pierced. Collective organization also generates resilience. In isolation, a worker faces intimidation, unemployment, and legal threats alone, vulnerable to the reprisals of capital. But in numbers, these reprisals lose their force. Solidarity creates protection, support, and mutual aid, enabling sustained resistance that would be impossible individually. Furthermore, organization allows for the coordination of knowledge, strategy, and resources. Individuals may see only a fragment of the larger picture, but collectively, workers can identify systemic patterns of exploitation, plan interventions, and mobilize communities. Information, once shared, becomes a weapon against deception, a tool for strategy, and a foundation for sustained struggle. History demonstrates repeatedly that the ruling class fears collective organization more than individual protest because organization multiplies power exponentially. Revolts succeed not when workers act in isolation, but when they act in concert, when they understand that their liberation is intertwined, and when they coordinate their efforts to achieve objectives that would be impossible for a single person. Unified action also builds consciousness. As workers coordinate and organize, they witness the strength of solidarity firsthand. They learn from one another, and they internalize the principle that the system's power depends entirely on division. Organization nurtures leadership, communication, and the capacity to resist manipulation. It provides a framework in which ideas are tested, decisions are debated, and strategies are refined. Through this process, the oppressed gain confidence in their own abilities, recognize the vulnerability of the oppressors, and understand that their power is not abstract, but tangible, enforceable, and collective. Collective organization is therefore both defensive and offensive. It defends against exploitation, marginalization, and intimidation, while simultaneously creating the means to demand justice, assert rights, and reshape society. Without it, any resistance is fleeting, vulnerable, and ultimately insufficient. Unified action also bridges differences, overcoming the artificial divisions, race, gender, nationality, and skill that the ruling class imposes to weaken the worker. When labor unites, it transcends these divisions, asserting that shared conditions and common interests outweigh imposed hierarchies. Solidarity in action teaches that strength resides not in individual competition, but in cooperation, not in isolation, but in coordination, not in submission, but in collective assertion. The capitalist system relies on the belief that power is concentrated and unassailable. Collective organization exposes this as a lie. Every assembly, every union, every coordinated strike demonstrates that the many, when united, can challenge the few, disrupt the extraction of wealth, and reclaim control over their labor. Power is not given, it is seized, and it is seized most effectively when workers act together. The history of social change, of rights won, of oppression challenged, is the history of organized labor confronting concentrated power, and every victory was a product of unity, strategy, and shared purpose. In this sense, collective organization is the indispensable bridge between consciousness and liberation, between awareness of oppression and the practical exercise of power. It transforms the potential of the many into the reality of change, creating a force that cannot be dismissed, ignored, or silenced. The system's strength depends entirely on disunity, atomization, and passivity, and it is through collective organization and unified action that the oppressed reclaim the power that is always theirs by virtue of their numbers, their labor, and their shared humanity. Speaking out and resisting is the path to reclaiming rights and dismantling oppression, because silence and submission are the lifeblood of the system, while voice and action are the weapons of liberation. Capitalism and all structures of domination survive by convincing the oppressed that endurance is virtue, compliance is wisdom, and resistance is futile. To speak is to challenge this deception, to assert that exploitation is neither natural nor inevitable, and to proclaim that the laborer is not merely a tool but a human being entitled to dignity, justice, and the fruits of their labor. Resistance begins in thought, in awareness, in the recognition that the conditions imposed upon the working class are not accidents or personal failings but products of systemic exploitation designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few. Speaking out is the first act of defiance because it interrupts the narrative constructed by the ruling class, a narrative that normalizes inequality, valorizes submission, and erases the possibility of collective strength. Words, whether whispered, written, or shouted, carry the potential to awaken consciousness, to reveal shared conditions, and to inspire others to reject the imposition of silence. Resistance is the practical manifestation of this awareness. It transforms anger into strategy, despair into determination, and isolation into solidarity. Without action, awareness remains impotent, a private recognition of injustice that changes nothing. When workers organize strikes, protests, petitions, or collective demands, they disrupt the mechanisms of exploitation, asserting control over their labor and refusing to allow their productivity to be consumed without consent. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, exposes the fragility of a system that depends on the acquiescence of the many, revealing that the power of the ruling class is not absolute but contingent upon compliance. Speaking out is also a moral act. It affirms that oppression cannot claim legitimacy through silence, that injustice must be named and confronted, and that the rights of the oppressed are inherent rather than granted. By resisting, workers reclaim authority over their own lives, refusing to be reduced to mere instruments of profit, refusing to accept conditions that violate their dignity, and refusing to allow their labor to be expropriated without consequence. History demonstrates that rights are never given freely, they are seized through struggle. The victories of labor movements, civil rights campaigns, and revolutionary struggles were not the product of passive endurance but of collective defiance, of voices raised in unison, and of action sustained against intimidation and repression. Speaking out also galvanizes others, transforming individual courage into collective power. When one worker challenges injustice, others see the possibility of resistance, recognize their shared conditions, and gain the confidence to act themselves. Resistance, therefore, is contagious. It spreads awareness, nurtures solidarity, and multiplies the efficacy of collective action. To resist is to confront the mechanisms of division that the system has imposed: fear, isolation, competition, and ideological manipulation. By acting together, by asserting rights collectively, workers dismantle not only immediate instances of oppression, but also the structures that maintain hierarchy and inequality. Resistance turns the tables, revealing that the authority of the oppressor is not inherent but maintained through intimidation, distraction, and fragmentation, and that these tools lose their potency in the face of united, determined action. Moreover, speaking out is an assertion of agency. It declares that the oppressed are not passive objects of history, but subjects capable of shaping it, that they have the power to demand justice, to challenge exploitation, and to envision a society where labor serves human need rather than private profit. Every petition signed, every rally attended, every coordinated act of defiance is a step toward dismantling the apparatus of oppression, a move that chips away at the legitimacy of domination, and a demonstration that collective action can confront and constrain power. Resistance also educates, revealing the structural nature of exploitation to those who may still believe in meritocracy, inevitability, or the neutrality of authority. By speaking and acting, workers teach one another, spread knowledge, and cultivate the understanding necessary for sustained struggle. In this sense, resistance is not merely reaction. It is construction, the building of a network of solidarity, the creation of strategies for change, and the establishment of a framework within which liberation becomes possible. Silence preserves injustice, but voice disrupts it. Passivity permits oppression to continue, but defiance exposes it and undermines it. To speak out and resist is to reclaim what has been taken, to assert the value of labour, the dignity of human life, and the right to self-determination. It is the path through which the oppressed can organise, challenge, and ultimately dismantle the structures that exploit and dominate them. The act of resistance is both symbolic and practical. It signals the refusal to accept the legitimacy of oppression while simultaneously enacting the power of collective action, demonstrating that the system's authority depends entirely upon the consent and silence of those it exploits, and that when the oppressed refuse to remain silent and unite in action, the foundations of exploitation begin to tremble. Comrades, the threads of our oppression are visible, and the forces that seek to silence, divide, and exploit us are no longer mysterious. They are deliberate, structural, and maintained by those who profit from our labour. Yet within this truth lies our power, for every act of awareness, every spark of consciousness, every voice raised, and every hand joined in solidarity reveals the fragility of the system that claims dominion over our lives. The silence imposed upon us, the divisions manufactured among us, the exploitation we endure, and the alienation we feel are not signs of inevitability, but symptoms of a system that fears our unity, that fears our voice, and that fears our capacity to act collectively. Liberation is not a gift, and freedom is not an abstraction. It is the result of our courage, our organization, and our relentless refusal to accept a world designed to benefit a few at the expense of the many. Our awareness illuminates the mechanisms of oppression. Our consciousness binds us together in shared purpose. Our collective action transforms potential into power, and our resistance shatters the illusions that sustain exploitation. Every moment we refuse silence, every step we act in solidarity, every declaration of injustice we challenge, we reclaim what is ours by right, the value of our labour, the dignity of our lives, and the authority over our destiny. The system survives only as long as we endure quietly, divided and complicit. It begins to crumble the instant we recognize our strength, unite our voices, and demand what has always belonged to us. Comrades, the path is clear. Speak, organize, resist, and act not for tomorrow, not for abstraction, but for the tangible liberation of the many, the reclamation of justice, and the construction of a society where labour serves humanity rather than profit. Our silence is their power, but our voice, our united, conscious, uncompromising voice is the force that can break the system, dismantle oppression, and forge a world worthy of those who toil.